For us, this is really a great honor. My name is Nick Gozik, and I'm the director of the Office of International Programs at Boston College. I'm joined by Jana Behrens, who is the director of Education Abroad at Amherst College. We represent the Outcomes Assessment and Research Committee. So as part of that committee, one of the functions we have is to work with the Undergraduate Research Award winners. We don't get to select the winners, but once they're selected, each one of us takes one of the winners and we go through a mentoring process to prepare them for today's presentation. So for today, there are a couple of things I wanted to mention about the award as we go through. Many of you have been here conference after conference, and I think we all agree that this is really the pinnacle of a student's experience abroad. It's the reason why we're in this field. The fact that we have students who go abroad and who do really high quality research, bring back that research and integrate it into the curriculum is incredible. The first award was given in 2004, so this is actually the 10th award presented, 10th series of awards. Each year, there are 2 recipients, and those recipients are chosen from institutions across the United States. It's a competitive award. There are applications that come from both in the US and abroad, as we'll see today. And each of those applications is reviewed by one of 20 faculty members from one of the myriad of Forum on Education Abroad institutional members. I would like to point out that the next award deadline is June 20th. So if you know now that you have students who might be good candidates, this is the time to start working with both students and faculty in order to make sure that before everyone disappears from campus, that you can get them in the pipeline. We have a couple people that we would like to thank on behalf of the Forum. First, the Forum thanks the School for Field Studies and C Semester for their sponsorship of this luncheon. If I could ask representatives from both organizations to stand. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Sorry to interrupt your lunch. The Forum also thanks the sponsors of the Undergraduate Research Awards, which make it possible for the students to attend this conference. And there are 2 such organizations. The Center for University Programs Abroad in Paris, CUPA, and IFSA Butler. And so if I could ask representatives from those institutions to stand, let's also give them a round of applause. Thank you very, very much. So we will begin with presentations, and afterwards we'll have a chance to ask both of the award winners questions about their research. I am very pleased, and I would actually use the word proud, to introduce the first of these winners for multiple reasons. One is the first winner, Narintohn Luangrath, is a Boston College student. It's a coincidence and a very happy one.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Narintohn Luangrath. As Dr. Gozik said, I'm a senior at Boston College, majoring in international studies and political science. And it's a great privilege and an honor to be here today at the Forum on Education Abroad in wonderful San Diego, California, much better weather than I'm accustomed to in Boston. So it's a very welcome change climate-wise. So before I get into a discussion about Ireland's asylum system and kind of why I went to Ireland to study, in particular the direct provision housing system in Ireland and its impact on asylum seeker children, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about my research interests and why I got interested in what I do today. So. My primary research interests surround forcibly displaced persons. This includes refugees, asylum seekers, as well as people who are forcibly displaced in cross-border movements but don't fall into either category of refugee or asylum seeker. This includes people being forcibly displaced due to non-persecutory reasons, one of the most common of which are natural disasters, generalized violence and conflict, state fragility and collapse, food insecurity, and a plethora of other reasons for non-persecutory displacement. And it's something that I'll really highlight towards the end of my presentation today. So before I get into kind of a more lengthy discussion of Ireland's asylum system, which is really broken right now, I wanted to make very clear the distinction between refugees and asylum seekers. I think these terms are often conflated in the literature, not only in academic literature, but also in policy work. According to the UN Refugee Agency, the 1951 UN Refugee Convention states that refugee status is derived only from a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. You'll notice here that people who are forcibly displaced due to non-persecutory reasons, such as natural disasters and generalized conflict and violence, do not fall under protection of the UN Refugee Convention. And this is something that's a bit problematic, not only in Ireland's asylum system, but also in asylum systems in different countries. So why Ireland? Why go to a country that has historically been a country of emigration rather than immigration? Why go to a country that's never been a colonial power and has only very recently, in the past 15 to 20 years, experienced an increase in asylum flows? And the reason why I went to Ireland, apart from the very strong connection that BC has with the country, Ireland has a very unique asylum application system, and the living arrangements of asylum seekers who arrive in Ireland vary pretty considerably. This is one of the housing arrangements for asylum seekers that began, many, many decades ago and continues to be practiced today, is the prison detention of asylum seekers, and this includes asylum seekers who have not actually committed any crimes. This led to a really big public outcry and a lot of outrage from human rights organizations, non-governmental organizations, and other civil society actors in Ireland who believed that housing asylum seekers, particularly young children, in prison detention with mainstream Irish criminals was really detrimental not only to the health and well-being of asylum seekers, but also undermined many of the human rights commitments that Ireland has made under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other human rights treaties. And so we see the rise in recent decades, the past 15 years, of what is called the direct provision housing system, which includes a lot of hostel-like housing accommodations in an enclosed area, usually in rural areas in Ireland. But there are also other unique kind of issues with this accommodation center. Most notably, the government promotes direct provision as housing on a full room and board basis, meaning that meals and utilities are provided for asylum seekers and their children. And also the government, despite not allowing asylum seekers to work and despite not allowing them to access other forms of housing while they're in direct provision, they also give an allowance of about 19 euros and 10 cents per adult and 9 euros and 60 cents per child each week. Another issue about direct provision housing is that we see a backlog in asylum applications in Ireland. Despite only receiving about 2,000 applications in 2011 and again in 2012, there's a pretty severe backlog in processing these applications. One of the biggest mysteries is as to why Ireland has been unable to deal with properly just about 2,000 asylum claims. And we see people being housed in direct provision housing sites, which are often not very well maintained, for 4 to 6 years on average, rather than a couple months, which is what the structures were intended to provide. And lastly, we also see the government relieving some level of responsibility for the maintenance of direct provision housing sites, namely by contracting private businesses to supply food and other necessities at these housing sites. One of the big problems with this is that we don't see the routine or regular presence of specialized medical facilities and care providers for asylum seekers and their children who have escaped, persecution, who have escaped violence, and who oftentimes carry with them when they arrive in Ireland severe trauma and physical distress. So given these issues, there are several research questions that I wanted to pursue while in Ireland. Firstly, I'm interested in how domestic law intersects with international law, particularly with countries' compliance with human rights treaties. And I was wondering as to why, given concerns over children's health and safety in direct provision housing sites, why have there been very limited reforms to this housing system? We see a very active civil society in Ireland that has advocated for change in issues like improving prison conditions, for example, and having the government respond very well to that. But we don't see a similar level of response on the issue of direct provision housing. And if you're unfamiliar with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which came into force in 1989, it's a human rights treaty which sets out the civil, political, economic, social, health, and cultural rights of children. And Ireland was one of the earliest ratifiers of the CRC. And if direct provision was originally introduced with the well-being of asylum seeker children in mind, I was curious as to see which articles of the CRC did the government of Ireland uphold, and to what extent did it do so effectively, and which articles did it fail to uphold. Secondly, I'm also interested not only on a normative level in terms of human rights compliance, but also on a policy level, and how can we use the lessons from Ireland to improve not only the Irish asylum policy, but also improve asylum policy in other countries. There's been very little scholarship on the relationship between the Convention on the Rights of the Child and Irish and asylum children more generally, and also very little scholarship which points to very particular policy recommendations that need to be instituted to improve asylum systems, not only in Ireland but in other countries. A really quick note in terms of methodology. As I stated earlier, I was a research policy and promotion intern with the Irish Human Rights Commission, and my paper topic that I ended up writing later stems from the policy and legal research I performed on direct provision housing when I was in Ireland for 2 months. This was a qualitative research study which consisted of desk research, consultations between myself and the IHRC Legal Inquiries Department, and consultations between the IHRC and non-governmental organizations, including the Irish Refugee Council, and international organizations like the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Refugee Agency. My research also relied heavily on statements retrieved from asylum seekers and their children in direct provision housing sites from Irish Refugee Council and pro bono attorneys working with these families. And this has really helped me actually when I was drafting my recommendations in my submission to the Irish government. And so this was a really great learning experience on that level. In terms of general findings, I would say there's certainly arguments that the government has promoted, and reasonable sounding ones, for continuing the system of direct provision housing. Direct provision was actually promoted by the government as supporting Article 9 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which articulates a child's right to the right to live with their parents. Proponents of direct provision argued that instead of incarcerating children, say in prisons, like what was the practice before, and or the separation of children from the incarcerated parent, this type of accommodation system promotes family unity and avoids the potential harms that children might be facing in Irish prisons. Secondly, the government discusses its child protection policy, which trains a lot of people who are working in these direct provision housing sites to look for signs of abuse or signs of any kind of harm being done to children. And that's something that the government has argued would be, not available in prisons, for example, where children face the threat of, or the risk of prison rape and other forms of abuse. And then lastly, the government obviously has a financial incentive for keeping direct provision the way it is. Ireland is one of the few, I think it was actually the only EU member state which does not allow asylum seekers in their country to have access to the welfare apparatus in their country. And so by not allowing asylum seekers to work, by not allowing them to have access to the welfare apparatus, and by enclosing them in direct provision housing sites, this has ultimately been a lot cheaper of an option for the Irish government. But I also view direct provision as a form of social exclusion. And what I mean by that is that, since housing sites are often located far from city centers, asylum seekers have had limited contact with Irish citizens. And if an asylum seeker's application for refugee status is eventually granted, those years in isolation actually end up making integration into Irish society very difficult. Another issue that I noticed while I was working on this case is that a lot of the rural locations of and lack of transportation infrastructure near most direct provision housing sites actually makes it very difficult for asylum seeker children to avail of schools in Ireland. Under Irish domestic law, asylum seeker children are actually allowed to enroll in Irish primary schools. However, because there's a lot of these schools are often inaccessible without a car or money to afford public transportation, we see a passive denial to the right to an education for asylum seeker children. And this is arguably a violation of Article 28 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which discusses the child's right to primary education. And lastly, with regards to kind of the asylum application backlog that I discussed earlier and the consequences that has for the overcrowding of direct provision sites, we see not only a lack of space in a lot of these housing sites, but some asylum seekers and their families are actually required to share one bedroom or one hostel-like accommodation room with non-relatives, with other asylum seekers. So if you imagine, living in a room a little bit bigger than a college dorm with another family, that's essentially kind of what the case is in some of these direct provision housing sites, which in such close quarters, not surprisingly, make children very vulnerable to verbal abuse, to physical abuse, and to other forms of harassment, which would undermine the protection that they're supposed to receive or allegedly receive by not being housed in Irish prisons. citizens. And so I think that's kind of the main summary of some of my findings with regards to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In terms of research implications and outside of Ireland, and also in terms of policy recommendations, I had several policy recommendations that I had ended up drafting for the Irish government, which was in response to their most recent human rights review at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. But I wanted to highlight one in particular, which I think that is kind of underlying a lot of the root causes for why Ireland is struggling to process just about 2,000 asylum claims per year, which is way lower than so many other Western countries. And one of these reasons is that, unlike a lot of other European Union countries, Ireland actually doesn't implement what is called a single protection procedure or single procedure system. And what a single procedure system does is that it allows officials the legal authority to ask the refugee-related questions or questions related to individual persecution of an applicant in the same interview as protection-related questions, which deal with the conditions in an asylum applicant's home country. And so because they don't have the single protection procedure system, we see a lot of Irish immigration officials asking the first part of the question in one interview, the questions related to individual persecution, and many, many months later, or maybe even years later, the second part, or the second protection-related questions end up being asked. And so we can see how this ends up creating a lot of unnecessary backlog in asylum applications and forcing a lot of asylum seekers to live in direct provision housing sites for months, if not years, until their asylum claims can be evaluated fully. So using a single protection procedure would actually allow for a combination of those questions to be done in one thorough interview. And lastly, I mean, in terms of the forced migrants who are displaced due to non-persecutory reasons and fall through the gaps in the international refugee protection regime, this is another issue that I encountered when I was working in Ireland, seeing people who don't fall under the definition of persecuted not being afforded the protection that they probably deserve. We have, asylum seekers and their children arriving from countries like Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, where generalized violence, not necessarily persecution, has regularly led to cross-border forced displacement, right? And so we see a lot of people falling through the cracks even though they are fleeing dangerous scenarios. But there's nothing in Irish asylum law and nothing in the international refugee protection regime to be able to accommodate so-called non-convention migrants. This also has roots in Ireland's own domestic law in the sense that when Irish asylum officials are evaluating asylum claims, they're only required to ask questions related to individual persecution, as I stated in the first interview. And so we have a lot of asylum applicants who are fleeing generalized violence or generalized conflict, needing protection, who are forced to then go through the first interview process, become denied refugee status because they don't fall under the persecution definition, given a deportation notification, and only then, only after all those things have happened, can they actually apply for subsidiary protection under on the basis of fleeing due to generalized conflict and violence or other non-persecutory threats. And so this was something that had really impacted me when I was studying. It ended up leading into a future senior thesis topic this year, and so that was really beneficial in that way, but really highlighted the problems with not only Ireland's asylum regime or American asylum regime, but also the international refugee protection regime as a whole. So I wanted to conclude a bit with some of the things that I've gained, I guess, participating in education abroad, if you will. And I think that this has garnered a lot of personal benefits to me, academic ones and professional ones. But my work in Ireland really gave me a greater understanding of the difficulties surrounding policymaking when it comes to asylum issues, or at least migration issues more generally, especially when they affect or specifically target children. National governments, not just Ireland's, really struggle to treat asylum seekers and their children humanely and respond appropriately to their unique needs. Unfortunately, fears related to asylum seeker fraud and abscondence during the claim evaluation process and corresponding national security concerns when we're examining the nexus between migration and national security usually govern a lot of the policies that are being created. And I really had to balance those concerns when I was writing my recommendations to the government with domestic pressure coming from immigrant immigrant rights activist groups or coming from NGOs like the Irish Refugee Council, who advocate for the right of asylum seekers and refugees. Although better treatment of asylum seekers is, of course, not necessarily incompatible with addressing Ireland's national security concerns, I really had to ensure that my policy recommendations addressed the government's frustration with the current backlog in the asylum system right now, as well as fears related to asylum seeker abscondence during the claim evaluations process. In terms of personal or professional benefits from my work abroad, I was actually recently hired by the Policy and Strategy Research and Evaluation Wing of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to work on asylum policies after my May 2014 graduation. So I'll be in Washington, D.C., which is a great place to be, to work on asylum policy issues. Oh. I guess in terms of academic benefits, as I noted earlier, my senior thesis actually looks at explaining the variation in country laws and why certain countries afford a more generous level of protection for non-convention migrants or those who flee due to non-persecutory threats versus other countries. And lastly, of course, as Dr. Gozik alluded in his introduction, that there is a really personal connection that I have with migration. I am the daughter of Thai and Laotian parents who are immigrants, but they came to the United States with several advantages. They were college educated. They were able to kind of navigate a lot of the government bureaucracy in terms of accessing services and accessing the state, if you will, and integrated a lot easier because they had very high English language proficiency, which is something that a lot of my relatives who were Laotian refugees after the Laotian Civil War, many of whom had endured the forced labor camps run by the communist Pathet Lao, their integration in American society was much different, and their access to the state was a lot more difficult. And so we see a lot of immigrant narratives talking about trying to reconcile, so to speak, the brutal bargain of trying to preserve cultural traditions and things like that, while also trying to integrate into Western society. And so working on kind of researching asylum seekers, and particularly the plight of children, really made me appreciate the different immigrant narratives that surround my family life, but also my academic life. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Thanks to the Forum on Education Abroad.